These are journalists. Your perception of them might be positive or negative, depending on your view. But have you considered that they are protecting your right to public information? The information we receive shapes our world. But imagine if those who protect our access to it are removed by people who want to prevent certain information becoming public. What world would that shape? In 2010, two young journalists working as interns for a local Mexican newspaper were sitting in a parked car outside of a mall when gunmen opened fire, killing 21-year-old Luis Carlos Santiago Orozco and severely injuring his 18-year-old colleague. The killers fled, but the operation was indicative of a drug cartel settling a score. The cartel's target was the newspaper the victims worked for because, unlike some other media agencies in the city, their newspaper had still been reporting on drug war-related crimes. However, this was the second killing of one of its journalists in 2 years, which led the newspaper to respond with a front-page editorial addressing the cartels. In it, they directly asked them what they should be publishing to avoid further death, injury, and intimidation of its staff. This is how a zone of silence begins, where reporting is no longer independent but controlled by those with power, like drug lords, corrupt officials, businessmen, and politicians. A zone where people cannot access information freely because journalists feel too threatened to report the news. Crimes against journalists are not just limited to a handful of countries. They occur anywhere where the powerful and corrupt want to hide the truth. That means in almost every country, attacks against journalists are committed, including harassment, intimidation, arbitrary imprisonment, kidnappings, violent attacks, and murder. Since 1993, 1,438 journalists have been killed. But the more shocking fact is that for every 10 cases of journalists murdered, only one ends in successful prosecution of the perpetrators. These killings include those dying while reporting armed conflict, but the majority are killed in countries without armed conflict, where journalists are uncovering local stories that some would prefer hidden. In many cases, those involved in these crimes are powerful enough to obstruct investigations and justice, but in other cases, impunity comes from bottlenecks within the justice system itself. In some countries, it's due to justice systems lacking human and financial resources. In others, it's due to corruption and a lack of transparency. While in some cases, it's a lack of knowledge of good practices to investigate these crimes. This often results in the killing of a journalist just being considered a common crime that has no connection to their profession. These shortcomings in justice systems lead to cases taking many years to resolve, if at all. They represent a breakdown in security and the rule of law, which furthers the cycle of violence against journalists. And where does this lead? To the expansion of global zones of silence. Zones where only powerful people decide the news you hear. Zones which violate our freedom of expression and our collective right as a society to access information. So, how do we solve this? The way forward starts with acknowledging the complexity of these crimes and considering them as crimes against freedom of expression, not just individuals. Central to solving this issue are judicial actors, those responsible for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. Collective knowledge of how to break the cycle of impunity is required to solve the issue, and efforts are currently being made to address this. UNESCO, for instance, is offering global online training, aiming to increase the understanding of international freedom of expression standards among judicial actors and law enforcement agencies. Support is being offered to journalists for their legal battles against attacks to silence them. And investigative journalist networks are working to resolve the crimes against their fellow journalists, while uncovering the stories that the perpetrators attempted to hide. But this is just a start. The solution still requires the collective efforts of member states, United Nations agencies, civil society organizations, regional human rights courts, and all judicial actors. So, if you're an actor in the judicial system, you can learn from successful prosecutions of crimes against journalists in other parts of the world and use these teachings to pursue cases in your own country. Because the best way to protect our journalists, to protect our collective rights, is not to give up on these cases, but to bring the perpetrators to justice. As always, the solution begins with awareness of the problem. So, by sharing this message, even if you feel that you're not directly involved, you are contributing to a global effort to end crimes against journalists and protecting freedom of expression and information.